My name is Gemma Green, and I am an Extension Master Gardener volunteer for Deer County. Welcome to our presentation for Beginning Gardening on the Outer Banks, or Gardening 101. Here are the points we will be covering today. They include why garden, factors that can make gardening difficult here on the Outer Banks, and tending your garden. Why garden, or why do I garden? I believe for a relatively small investment, I reap some big rewards from gardening. First, there's that sense of accomplishment. My garden is something I've created. That leads to that sort of warm, fuzzy feeling I get whenever someone compliments me on my garden. And finally, I love that gardening allows me to provide a home and food for bees and birds and butterflies. And in that small way, I feel I'm enhancing my environment. For me, these things equal joy and satisfaction, and that's why I garden. And I believe gardening can do similar things for you. As I start this presentation, I'd like to briefly go over some gardening terms that can be somewhat confusing if you haven't done much gardening. First, there's perennial versus annual. Perennial, this doesn't mean a plant that's going to live forever. It does mean a plant that will live for 2 or more years, versus annual, which is a plant that only lives for one season. In some cases, plants that are annuals further north can be perennials here on the Outer Banks, such as snapdragons. Then there's hardiness zone versus vegetation zone. Hardiness zone refers to the areas mapped out by the United States Department of Agriculture using an area's average low winter temperature, while vegetation zone refers to the climate and soil conditions of a particular area. There can be many vegetation zones within one of the USDA's hardiness zones. Hybrid. A hybrid is a plant that is the result of crossbreeding of 2 different varieties of a plant versus an heirloom, which is a plant that has not been crossbred in 50 or more years. Hybrids are created to improve or highlight certain characteristics of a plant. A few other terms. Determinate. This applies to a plant bred to limit its heights and enable it to produce early fruiting, whereas indeterminate is a plant that grows indefinitely tall and usually bears its fruit later. These terms are usually applied to tomatoes. Native. A native plant is indigenous to a specific habitat or area. For example, the Venus flytrap is a native to a very small area in North and South Carolina, where a non-native is, of course, a plant that's been introduced from other regions or countries. While this is not necessarily bad, in some cases, non-native plants can become invasive, pushing out the native plants. Then finally, there's gardening soil versus potting soil. Gardening soil contains topsoil, as well as some wood products, while potting soil doesn't contain actual soil at all. It's lighter and drains faster than gardening soil. It's a mixture of perlite, pine bark, sand, peat moss, and vermiculite. For container gardening, you must use potting soil, not gardening soil, which is too dense and too compact. With these in mind, let's move on to gardening on the Outer Banks. As you know, the Outer Banks is part of a fragile and dynamic chain of mobile barrier islands, but all parts of these barrier islands are not the same. The character and habitat varies greatly from east to west on our narrow band of sand. There are 4 basic vegetation zones on the Outer Banks. There's oceanfront, dune, maritime forest, and marsh. First, oceanfront. These areas are the harshest and most challenging for gardening. High winds, salt spray, and the possibility of ocean overwash, as well as very sandy soil, makes this a very difficult environment for most plants to survive. As you move away from the ocean, you have the dune zone. The effects of salt and wind are not as great here, but they are still major factors. The environment here is usually dry with sandy soil. However, this area is more sheltered from the ocean, and a wider variety of plants grow here. The third vegetation zone is the maritime forest, which is quite shady, and the soil is less sandy. The effects of the wind and salt are diminished because of the distance from the ocean and the dense vegetation, which offers greater protection from the elements. Finally, the Soundside Marsh Zone is unique and vital to barrier island health. Plant communities here protect the shoreline from erosion. They act as collection and filtering mechanisms for the water and provide food and shelter for waterfowl, fish, and other aquatic animals. Keep in mind that also within these 4 zones, there are many microclimates. For example, the southwest corner of my property is way different from the northeast corner. Besides the vegetation zones, there are other factors that challenge growing things here on the Outer Banks. I've mentioned some of them already: salt spray, windy conditions, and sandy soil. But let's look at them a bit closer and look at some additional factors. First, salt spray. Even if your property is not oceanfront, you will be affected by salt spray. Water droplets formed by breaking waves are laden with ocean salt. During storms, the wind carries the droplets westward, and these droplets, with their salt, land on your plants. Salt and plants are not a good mix. Then there's the wind. Wind affects plant growth in several ways. It carries that sea salt to your plants, as I mentioned, and it causes erosion of soil and exposure of root systems. Northeast winds during late winter months and cold gale force winds in the spring damage newly emerging leaves, and hurricane winds in the summer and fall break branches and stems and uproot trees. Sandy soil. Sand is a challenging growing medium for plants. It often does not contain adequate nutrients. Although good drainage is important for growing, water draining through sand does it very quickly. It's difficult to note if the plants are receiving adequate moisture when growing in sandy soil. In addition to those 3, there is heat. Extended periods of heat dry out the soil and is detrimental to healthy plant growth. Extreme heat, think of July and August here on the Outer Banks, can lead to death for many plants. And despite our sandy soil, during heavy rainstorms, low-lying areas here on the Outer Banks tend to collect water and may not drain as readily as other areas. The root systems of many plants cannot survive in heavy, wet soil. Finally, lack of rainfall. Long periods of drought, usually defined as 3 to 4 weeks without rain, are not uncommon on the Outer Banks and can stunt all your plants. With all these factors affecting plants, how can you successfully start a garden here on the Outer Banks? Success depends on knowledge and planning. Obviously, you're adding to your garden knowledge by attending this presentation, but planning is also very important to successful gardening. And by planning, I mean you should have a vision of what you want to grow, and then you should join that vision with what you have to grow it in other words, your property. Take the time to analyze your property in order to select the right location for your garden. Then, record the steps you want to take to achieve that vision, as well as record a time frame for those steps. So, do you have a vision for your garden? With that vision in mind, walk around your yard and, using a site map or a map of your own design, sketch out your hardscape, your house, your driveway, your garage. Note the areas that get full sun or partial sun or little or no sun. Mark areas where water collects after a rainstorm. Record existing trees and shrubs because these may compete for sunlight, water, and nutrients where you want to locate your garden. Other questions to ask yourself: what about that wind? Which way does it blow across your property? Mark that down. Now, is there also a view you'd like to enhance or one you'd like to hide with a garden? Sketch that out. Starting a garden journal or log will help you record these facts and guide you in your planning. It can also be used to, first of all, record what plants you plant and where you plant them, the weather, including rainfall amounts, and your garden successes, as well as your gardening failures, so you can learn from those failures. Planning and journaling will give you a clear starting point for your garden. Let's move on to other questions. What type of garden do you want? If you have a large area, you may consider a traditional in-ground garden. It's labor-intensive at first. Think you have to dig it out. But it can make good use of your available space, or you may want to put in raised beds. Raised beds can be built by simply mounting up your soil or by actually constructing a box or bed using a variety of materials. But keep in mind, do not use materials that might leach chemicals into the soil. A raised bed garden is initially more expensive and time-consuming, but the soil in a raised bed heats up quicker in the spring and stays warmer longer in the fall, so you may extend your growing season. Or, if your space is limited, you could consider a container garden. Not only flowers, but many vegetables can be grown in containers. In fact, you can even grow shrubs and trees in containers. And most containers can be moved to meet the plant's needs for light or to protect it from strong winds or storms. Or you can do what many gardeners here in the Outer Banks do. That is, a combination of all these types of gardens. Some special notes for container gardens in particular. If containers are your method for growing vegetables or any other plants, there are a few things you should remember. First, your containers must have drainage holes. Second, use only container potting soil. As mentioned, potting soil is lighter, so it doesn't compact like garden soil. This allows for better drainage and oxygen uptake of the roots in your containers. Third, if you're growing tomatoes in containers, choose determinate varieties. You also want to pick bush or dwarf varieties of other plants for container gardening. Fourth, you will need to water more frequently, especially during very hot days. Containers dry out faster than in-ground gardens. And finally, fifth, frequent watering also means nutrients wash out more than in an in-ground garden. You will have to fertilize more. It's best to use a water-soluble, one that dissolves in water, or slow-release granulated fertilizer. You don't want to over-fertilize your plant. Read and follow all directions on the labels, and I'm going to say that several times. Once you have your vision in mind and you've analyzed your property and you've decided what type of garden you want, there are other things to keep in mind. First of all, sunlight and water. Sunlight. Most plants need at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight to grow successfully, unless they're considered shade-tolerant plants. Vegetables and fruit, in fact, do best with 8 to 10 hours of sunlight. Water. On average, most plants need at least 1 inch of water per week to survive and grow. Here on the Outer Banks, you can't always depend on nature to provide rain, so you will have to water your garden due to our summer heat and our sandy soil. But take care not to overwater. Overwatering is one sure way to kill a plant. You can purchase a water meter to check the level of moisture in your soil, or you can simply insert a finger down to your first knuckle, or about 1 inch, into your soil to see if it's dry. If it's dry, water. If it isn't, wait. If possible, locate your garden near a water source, because water in a watering can is heavy and difficult to move around, and dragging a hose isn't much fun. In addition to sunlight and water, you must consider the soil. If you plan on an in-ground or raised bed gardening, your best chance for success is to have a soil test done by submitting a soil sample to the State Department of Agriculture. Soil test kits are available through the Dare County Cooperative Extension Office. North Carolina is one of the few states that offers free soil testing during the months of April through November. All you have to do is pay for shipping. From December through March, there is a $5 fee. The results of the soil test will enable you to correct the soil and amend it, that is, add the needed nutrients or fertilizers. As mentioned earlier, container gardens require potting soil, and a soil test isn't necessary. And then there's fertilizing. Please fertilize only as needed. Usually you fertilize when you first plant your garden in the spring. However, some plants may need additional fertilizer partway through the growing season. As mentioned before, plants in containers will need more fertilizing. In all cases, you must avoid over-fertilization. This can produce a lot of plant growth with lush leaves, but decrease flowering and fruit development. It also really weakens the plants, making them more prone to pest or disease problems. I can't stress enough that before you fertilize, you must read that fertilizer's label and follow all directions as outlined. Another key element that affects plant growth is the cold. How hardy a plant is, that is, how much cold can it survive in, is obviously very important to know. The USDA Plant Hardiness Zone Map is the key for this information. The Outer Banks falls into USDA hardiness zone 8B. If you want to know if a particular plant can grow in zone 8B, check the plant tag at the nursery or to the description in a plant catalog. It should be listed there. And while it's important to know if a particular plant can be grown in a particular zone, there are all those other factors that were mentioned earlier, including rainfall, wind, sunshine. They all play a significant role in what can grow in a location and are not considered in drawing up the USDA plant hardiness zone map. And don't forget those vegetation zones we have on the Outer Banks. They play a role too. Yet another factor that plays a role in our climate here on the Outer Banks is the fact that we're surrounded by water. This means we tend to have warmer winter temperatures, well, maybe not this year, and a longer growing season. Our average last frost date is April 15th, and our first frost date isn't until well into November. So we usually can start our gardening much earlier on the Outer Banks and continue much later into the fall than folks do further north. And our climate means we are fortunate to be able to grow many tropical plants as perennials here. This includes lantana, hibiscus, certain palms, figs, and even citrus. We can also grow many plants from more northern climates, such as blueberries, grapes, and most vegetables. But of course, some plants do better than others. So let's go over some of the plants that will do well here on the Outer Banks. If you're planning on having a vegetable garden, grow what you like to eat, but also consider expanding your choices of vegetables. Also consider the space you have, and if it's limited, concentrate on vegetables that yield the greatest amount, such as tomatoes or perhaps leafy greens. If you're planning on a flower or landscape garden and are from further north than the Outer Banks, you may not be able to grow some of the plants you're familiar with. For example, lilacs. Why? Some plants actually require cold temperatures during the winter in order to survive and thrive. Remember, check that plant's USDA hardiness zone. In all cases, if you plan to purchase plants, spend some time looking at the plant over before you buy. You want healthy plants, of course, with strong stems, good green leaf color, and a vigorous root system, but not root bound. That is, with the roots wrapped around the inner side of the container. Pull the plant out a bit and check. A reputable nursery won't mind if you do this. Starting with vegetables and the big three, tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, they all do very well here. Keep in mind, though, these three plants are in the same plant family, so should not be planted in the same location one year after another, since they can carry the same long-lived soil-borne plant diseases and pass them on. You want to practice plant rotation. This means if you plant tomatoes in one spot in your garden this year, you shouldn't plant tomatoes or peppers or eggplants in that same spot next year, or even the year after that, or the year after that. You can plant a vegetable from another plant family, for example, beans or squash, or even flowers or herbs in that spot. Or you may want to consider planting your tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants in containers, where you change out that potting soil annually so you don't run into those problems. Another point, these three are definitely warm season vegetables, but they're not particularly fond of very hot weather. Get them in the ground early, late April to early May, so they can start putting out blossoms and fruit before July and August. During these hot months, tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants will start producing fruit, but don't give up on them. Keep them well watered, but not overwatered during these months, and they'll start putting out fruit again in September right through October. These three also tend to need a bit more fertilization than some other vegetables. But as mentioned earlier, take care not to over-fertilizer. Once again, read the labels on the fertilizer package carefully and follow all directions. Other warm season vegetables to do well here include butter beans, okra, and black-eyed peas. Butter beans, also known as lima beans if you're from further north. These seem to do better here on the Outer Banks than bush or pole beans, mainly because they like warm weather. Okra. Even if you think you don't like okra, give them a try. These plants are really spectacular. The standard varieties can grow 6 to 7 feet tall, but there are dwarf varieties if you don't want to plant quite that tall. They all have beautiful flowers since they're of the hibiscus family, and their pods, when picked often and small, are not slimy, and they add their unique taste to those very southern dishes of gumbo and jambalaya. Then there's black-eyed peas. The black-eyed pea is more like a bean than a green pea, but it likes hot weather, so it does very well here. What doesn't do well are string beans, cucumbers, and squash. Squash and cucumbers, like tomatoes, like warm weather, but not the extreme hot weather we get here. So I'm not saying don't plant them, but you may not get the same kind of yield as you would further north. Another note for squash. If you want to grow summer squash, that's zucchini or yellow squash, you need to avoid the squash vine borer, which will definitely kill your squash. To do this, plant your squash transplants or sow your squash seeds in late June, since the squash borer moth tends to lay her eggs before mid-June. Unfortunately, when you plant that late, you tend to run into that hotter temperature, and I said squash does not like really, really hot weather. Similar, cucumbers are the same. They tend to like cooler temperatures than we have here during the peak of summer. Usually you can grow cool season vegetables much earlier here, January, February, but maybe not this year, or much later, November, December. Cool season vegetables include spinach, radish, carrots, and green onions. And these all can be sown directly into your garden. You don't need transplants. And if you have room and you like it, consider devoting some garden space for an asparagus bed. Asparagus does very well in our sandy soil. It's one of the few perennial vegetables, so you do need a permanent space for it. It does take at least a couple of years to establish an asparagus bed, so you need to be patient until you can harvest it. And if you're going to grow vegetables, you should also grow herbs. Herbs not only enhance your eating pleasure, but interspaced with your vegetables, herbs can help to attract pollinators and other good bugs, for example, ladybugs. Listed here are some of the herbs that do well in the Outer Banks. Herbs aren't fussy as far as soil goes. Some, in fact, do better in poorer soil. Although they all do fine in full sun, they can also be grown with less direct sunlight. Annual herbs that are listed can also be grown easily from seeds sown directly in the ground or in a container. A special note for parsley. With parsley seeds, soak them for about a day before planting. This helps break down their outer cover and lets them sprout more easily. Pinch or snip back parsley and basil and use the leaves throughout the summer. Doing this encourages growth, more vigorous growth, and keeps the plants from bolting, that is, starting to flower. Once they do this, they tend to lose some of their flavor. Another annual herb that many gardeners like to grow is cilantro. Cilantro is another one of those plants that doesn't like really hot weather, so it should be started very early in the spring. The perennial herbs listed will do fine either planting in the ground or in a container. I'll add an added bonus with rosemary is that it blooms right now in January and February, even when the weather is cold. Speaking of flowering plants, flowering perennials. Perennials tend to have a set bloom period. For example, some only bloom in the spring or some bloom in the fall. There are many, many more flowering perennials on the Outer Banks than these 6 listed. I'm mentioning them in particular since they do very, very well here. Other flowering native plants include coreopsis, which is also known as tick seed, or gaillardia, or blanket flower. You see gaillardia growing everywhere here on the Outer Banks, even on the sand dunes and vacant lots. And then there's butterfly weed. This is a type of milkweed that attracts monarch butterflies, so if you're like me and you want to attract butterflies to your garden, plant this. In addition to those listed, another non-native which you see everywhere in the Outer Banks is oleander. It's a tropical plant, so if we have a very cold winter, it will die back, but it does recover very nicely. Unlike perennials, annuals tend to bloom all summer long. Many annuals do well here. Impatiens, which is a good shade plant, as well as marigold, zinnias, cosmos, petunias, just to name a few. You can purchase annuals as plants, or you can grow them more economically by starting them from seed. They readily fill in gaps in the perennial garden, and you can add them to your vegetable garden to make it more interesting. And this also encourages the bees and the butterflies to visit and help with pollinating your vegetables. Then there's grasses, trees, and shrubs. Like flowering annuals and perennials, there are many, many more ornamental grasses, trees, and shrubs that do well here, in addition to those listed. Why grow them? Grasses, trees, and shrubs all add interest, as well as focal points and structure to any garden. Sea oats, muley grass, as well as live oaks and Indian hawthorn are all native plants. And surprisingly, crepe myrtle isn't a native. It grows everywhere here, though. And I'd like to give a big shout out for fig trees. Again, the fig isn't a native to the Outer Banks, but it does very well here. Not only adding to the landscape, providing you with lots of those tasty fruits. They're very easy to grow and take care of. The brown turkey and Celeste figs are recommended varieties for the Outer Banks. All the plants that we've mentioned here are really just a small glimpse of the wide variety of plants that can grow on the Outer Banks, despite the challenges of gardening we face here with our climate and environment. Finally, while not hard, taking care of or tending your garden is an important part of being a successful gardener, not only here on the Outer Banks, but really anywhere you garden. It boils down to 4 tasks. First, there's weeding. And really, this isn't so bad a chore if you do it on a regular basis. And if you mulch your garden, it'll help keep the weeds down. You want to keep that mulch a few inches away from your plants, since you don't want to smother your plants, only the weeds. About 3 inches of mulch should do it. That's thick. For vegetable gardens, only use compost, straw, or straw paper or shredded paper for mulch. Don't use wood products. Watering. Again, the rule of thumb is most gardens need 1 inch of water per week to get. And so get a rain gauge and monitor how much water nature provides, and only water when it's needed. Mulching also helps keep and retain moisture in your garden. And consider investing in a drip irrigation system. Spending some money on an irrigation system can save you a lot of time watering your garden. And there are many drip irrigation kits on the market today, so can you easily install this yourself, so it's not that expensive. Then there's feeding or fertilizing. It bears repeating. One mistake that's so easy to do in gardening is to over-fertilize. Take the time to have your soil tested. The test results will tell you what fertilizer you need to add and how much. During the course of the growing season, you will have to fertilize, but not as often as you may think. And remember, your best bet is to use either a water-soluble or a granulated, slow-release fertilizer. And once again, read and follow all the directions. And watch for pests or problems. One of the pleasures of having a garden is being able to walk through your plants, enjoying the smells and colors and sounds of your garden. And while you enjoy your garden, you can do a simple check for bugs and pick them off. Gardeners can't be squeamish. Instead of using an insecticide, much better, especially if you have a vegetable garden. A daily walk also gives you a chance to look more closely at a plant that seems to be having an issue. So this allows you to take care of these things when they're small, rather than letting them get out of hand. And if you do have gardening problems, master gardeners are here to help you if you run into a garden issue. There are 3 ways to get in touch. First of all, call Ask a Master Gardener at 252-473-4290 or email us at greenlineobx@gmail.com, or finally you can drop in either at the Arboretum and Teaching Gardens Wednesdays from 9 through 11. March through November, we have a Ask a Master Gardener table there. The Arboretum, if you're not familiar with it, is a wonderful place to visit, get great gardening ideas. It's located at 300 Mustine Avenue, Kill Devil Hills. You can also drop in at the Dare Extension Center, but I would suggest that it's a good idea to call before dropping in there. They have regular business hours, Mondays through Friday, 9 to 5. They're located in Manteo on Budley Street. It's 517 Budley Street. In conclusion, gardening on the Outer Banks does present a lot of challenges, but the rewards make overcoming these challenges well worth the effort. Even if something doesn't work out, please don't give up. Record it in your gardening journal and try something new. Our sources for some of the information included in this presentation is Vegetable Gardening, A Beginner's Guide. It's a North Carolina Extension publication, and if you would like to read it in its entirety, you can access it by going to the link that's on your screen now. Once you get to that location, in the search box, you should enter Beginning Gardening, and the publication Vegetable Gardening, A Beginning Guide should pop up as the first one. While it's written for beginning vegetable gardening, the principles covered in this guide apply to all gardening. And as I said, it goes over what we covered as well as gives you more information on planting, including a table on plant families, which I mentioned very, very briefly, and a plant rotation plan. So that's it. Thank you so much for your time.